Hi sewing friends! This tutorial is to help you with cutting your fabric and quilting your quilt sandwiches for the Take A Stand Tote from ByAnnie Patterns. So let's go ahead and get started. First, you're going to need to gather your supplies, and so for this part of the project, you're going to need your main fabric. My main fabric is this floral. And then you are going to need to grab your lining fabric. I am using a rusty batik that matches my floral really well. Next, I am grabbing a large quilting ruler. We're going to draw some long lines, so I want a large ruler. And because I'm using my rotary wheel, we want to also use a cutting mat so we don't mess up the table. I'm going to use tailor's chalk to draw some lines. Your preferred marking method is fine though. We will be using a quilt basting spray to adhere one of our fabrics. And then because my foam is a single-sided fusible, I will be needing to use my iron and my ironing mat, which I did not include in the scene here. And then I will show you my single-sided fusible. I opted for single-sided so that way I can demonstrate both fusible foam as well as the quilt basting spray. I also find it's easier to use than double-sided foam. So that is all of our supplies. We are going to be cutting fabric to make 2 quilt sandwiches, and both of those quilt sandwiches are going to measure the same. The only difference will be is if you are making the small bag versus the larger bag. So for either bag, you are going to need to cut 2 of your main fabric, 2 of your lining fabric, and 2 of your foam stabilizer. If you are making the small bag, each of these cuts will need to measure 26 inches by 16 inches. And if you are making the larger bag, these cuts will need to measure 35 inches by 19 inches. Let's go ahead and get started with cutting our main fabric. So for this bag, I am making my sample to be the smaller bag because I've already made the larger bag as a sample. And for that, my fabric will need to be 26 inches by 16 inches. And because the fabric requirement was already at 3/4 of a yard, we're about 27 inches in length, so I don't need to cut to the length at all. I just need to cut my width to be 16 inches. Because I have a smaller cutting space in my home, I am folding my fabric in half, matching selvage edges, so that way I can just cut it easier. I'm using the selvage edge to line everything up and make sure I'm folding it nice and evenly. From there, I am going to line up the selvage edge with the edge of my cutting mat. I am leaving the selvage on to just make sure everything stays nice and straight. So I added a little bit to compensate for that selvage edge, but the finished piece will measure 26 by 16. I'm throwing pattern weights onto my ruler because it holds everything nice and steady as I cut through the fabric. And then I'm going to repeat this process, just scooching the fabric over and cutting another piece that's 26 by 16. So I then have 2 of my main fabric, and then I can move on to my lining piece. And with my lining, I'm just doing the same process, folding my fabric in half to better fit onto my cutting mat, and then cutting at the 16-inch mark, using my pattern weights again to make this easier, scooching that fabric over and recutting it again at 16 inches. So I will then have 2 lining pieces that measure 26 by 16 and 2 main fabric pieces that measure 26 by 16 as well. And let's move on to our foam. For my foam stabilizer, I was using leftover from a different project, and I had bought yardage, so I had a really long piece that I just cut down to be about 18 inches. I was quick cutting it so it's not quite 16 inches wide like it should be. And then as I adhere the main fabric and the lining fabric to it, I cut down the length to be the 26 inches long. But for you, I definitely recommend cutting it to the right size before putting the fabric on it, because it will just be easier. Sorry that I don't actually demonstrate that. Anyways, let's move on to drawing our lines. So for drawing your lines, I'm going to use my quilting ruler, and I'm going to draw from one corner to the next. And I'm mostly going to have to just eyeball this because there's no real way to line it up perfectly. Even with a really long ruler, it just doesn't quite stretch. So I'm just double checking it, eyeballing it as best I can, and then drawing on that line from one corner to the next corner. And I do just go over the line a little bit because I was a little too soft-handed the first time, and I want to make sure I can really see that first line. From there, I am going to measure 1.5 inches away from the first line I drew and just mark that with chalk. And I'm going to keep repeating this process, drawing lines all the way across at 1.5 inches apart. And while I know this can be a bit tedious, and there are guides that you can put onto your walking foot to perfectly space out your lines, avoid having to mark all of this out, I prefer to draw lines so I can see what my quilting design will look like, so that way I can better visualize it. It's just chalk, it does come off, and this way I know what my finished project will look like. I do repeat the process, going the opposite direction, drawing a line from corner to corner again, and then 1.5 inches apart to create a beautiful diamond effect. And this is what my quilting lines will look like. Alright, so on my pressing mat, I have placed my single-sided fusible foam with the fusible side up. And then I am going to fuse that onto my lining fabric. So I'm just going to place my lining fabric right on top of that foam and begin ironing it. I am making sure to line up 2 edges of my fabric, making sure those 2 edges are nice and even, ignoring the others, so that way I can just cut off those edges later, but making sure 2 are lined up to make it easier to match my main fabric later. And then I'm ironing with a firm amount of pressure. I am using light steam because the glue does need heat and steam to activate. And then I am just lightly moving it around, making sure that I don't get any bubbles in my fabric as I go, making sure not to put my iron onto the foam itself. I don't want to get that glue on my iron. And then just watching to make sure that the foam is actually fusing to the fabric. I want to make sure that it's not sticking. And then here you can see I'm just checking it. And once I am sure it is all ironed on, I will cut off that extra bit and attach my main fabric. To attach my main fabric, I am going to use quilt basting spray. I got single-sided fusible so I can show you 2 different methods of creating your sandwich. I'm going to line up my main fabric, making sure to match up the edges on the other side where the fabric is, not on that empty space. I'm going to make it nice and flat and even before I start folding over one edge to apply the basting spray. So I start by folding over just one edge, spraying the basting spray, and then attaching that edge, smoothing it out, making sure it's nice and flat and even. And then I will carefully fold over the rest of the fabric and get it out of the way before spraying another small section. I will then smooth the fabric back out, make sure it is lined up straight, and then fold it back again and spray another small portion. I'll do this in sections so that way it continues to stay nice and even, nice and straight on those edges, and not get all wonky. Here I'll just finish it off and line everything back up and have a nice, wonderful sandwich that is ready to quilt. Don't forget to repeat this whole process so that way you have 2 quilt sandwiches. I only showed me creating 1 quilt sandwich. You do need 2 quilt sandwiches to create this bag. So go ahead and re-adhere both your main fabric and your lining fabric in the exact same way, so you have 2 quilt sandwiches to then take to your machine to quilt. Okay, so to sew my quilt lines, I am going to start at one corner. That main line that I drew from corner to corner is where we're going to start, and I'm just going to sew straight down and quilt my first line. I am using the dual feed on my Bernina. My machine has a dual feed feature, otherwise I would be using the walking foot. Either one is great, you just do want to have something on your machine that will equally feed your sandwich through, because you don't want too much pressure being applied to your fabric. It will cause a lot of shifting in your project. From there, I am going to cut the thread off and I'm going to move my sandwich back to the start. I'm going to sew the line directly to the right of that first line that we sewed. And I know there's a lot of debate between people of if you should continue sewing everything in the same direction or if you should pivot and go back the opposite direction. It is something I firmly believe is preference, with my preference being to go back to the same spot. I think sewing it shifts it some, and I'd rather it all shift in the same direction rather than shifting along the bias in different directions and causing ripples in the quilting. It's very easy to get ripples in the quilting. It's why you will see me kind of smoothing everything out as I go. I'd rather everything shift as one and create nice, even, smooth lines. Then I'm going to pick it up and move it right back to the beginning again. And we are going to the right because we want to quilt all of the right side first. So that way, as we start to quilt the left-hand side, the right side is all done. So as we have to roll it to fit it through the throat plate, it will fit a little easier. And we don't have to worry about the basting spray or our fusing coming undone. We know that the quilted lines themselves are going to hold everything in place for us. And periodically, while I'm sewing these quilted lines, I like to just pull the fabric out and make sure that the underside hasn't done anything weird while I wasn't looking at it. Nothing worse than sewing all of these lines and finding out you had a giant weird bubble underneath or something. So just check it, make sure everything is going nice and smooth, and you can crank out those lines. Once you are done with the right side, you can go ahead and move on to the left side of your center line. I apparently forgot to film that, but here you can see as I'm going through the lines closer to the edge, I'm rolling the already quilted part, and I know it is holding itself there nice and well because it is already quilted. And once we are done with the first set of lines, we are going to go ahead and rotate that sandwich and repeat the entire process going the opposite way. Going from corner to corner first, and then moving to the right. It's not as important once all of the fabric has already been quilted once, but I like to repeat the same process to just make sure I get it right by not deviating. And then just go ahead and keep quilting until you have a fully diamond quilted sandwich. And then you get the really fun task of repeating this entire process with your second quilted set. But don't worry, that is it. That is all of the prep you have to do before class. That's it. Once you have finished quilting both of your quilt sandwiches, you are done. You are ready to move on into cutting your quilt sandwiches down to create your pockets and your sides, as well as cutting the rest of your fabric. If you're taking this class with me in person, this is your stopping point. You do not need to do anything else before coming to class. If you're making the bag at home, you're ready to move on to the next step. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope you will give it a like down below, subscribe to the channel. I create lots of different sewing content. And if you need a written guide to go with this, you can also check out the link in the description. It will bring you to a written blog version of this tutorial because I know sometimes video just doesn't quite cut it. So in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed. I hope your bag turns out fantastic, and pleasant seams, everybody.